Onassis Foundation.
Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello?
Hello, could I please speak with Casey Gerald?
This is Casey. Hi, Paul.
Casey, what a pleasure to have you on the line. Thank you so much for taking my call, and thank you so much for being part of the Quarantine Tapes. Tell me, Casey, how have you been spending these last 7 months of this delirious, dire, dark period?
Oh, don't make it sound so bad, Paul.
Okay. Help me make it sound good.
Sure, let's see if I can pull that off. I started the quarantine in New York. I was in Brooklyn living when things shut down and was there throughout and doing a lot of writing. Funny enough, I'm sure many writers feel similarly. I had been complaining about all the time I didn't have to start working on this script for the film adaptation of my book. Went on complaining, I need to go to the mountains. I need to go to the woods. I need to get out of town. New York is crushing me with all these social obligations. And then 2 days later, the city shut down. So I sat in my apartment in New York and worked and tried to stay sane and meditated a lot. And took a lot of walks alone in the empty streets and prayed a lot. One of the biggest things that happened was through a piece I was writing and through just life, I guess, in general. My grandmother had died in 2018, and I started an essay about her death and about loss and about grief in general at that time. And I remember writing the first words of it in the airport in Paris in July 2018. And I actually had just finished hanging out with Lisa Lucas, who I know you've had on the program already, in Paris. And she had just lost her father. And so there was a lot of just sort of grieving that we were doing. And then I tried to write about it, but nothing came, And so a few years passed, and this summer came, and through a sort of spiritual teacher of mine, I started doing these ancestral prayers and developed this really fascinating relationship with my grandmother, who is dead in body, but actually we talk pretty seriously every day, and we have a pretty good relationship. So the essay changed, and my sense of death changed, and loss and grief. And so I've thought a lot about that in this time of so much loss at such a grand and awful and horrible scale. And I came across that great Clarice Lispector line the other day in The Hour of the Star. She says, "Do not mourn the dead; they know what they are doing." And
it's wonderful because it is so serious, and yet funny.
That's exactly right. So I've thought a lot about those things, and then more practically, aside from working and writing and praying and thinking. I went out to the desert in West Texas for 2 weeks, which was a very sort of holy experience. Survived an encounter with a baby Mojave rattlesnake and dropped acid for the first time and fell in love and all these things. And then about a month ago, I moved to Texas. So I'm now in Austin and trying to set up life here.
What was that first sentence that you had worked on in Paris about your grandmother, if you don't mind my asking?
Oh, no one ever tells you how much of life is losing.
What came afterwards?
Oh, afterwards, it's funny because you're calling from Los Angeles, and I was living in Los Angeles at the time. And it said something to the extent, and I'll try to remember this without pulling it up. I walk each morning to a long wooden table at the center of a large white room, sit in a straight back leather chair with a yellow legal pad and a black pen and a black mug of black coffee to begin my morning ritual. 3 pages of untamed thoughts, to meditate for 10 minutes, to feel grounded and present and connected to God. I say most mornings, near minute 2, to feel better. I say instead, when the young day has brought misfortune simply by beginning. And then it goes on.
How do you feel your grandmother feeling this? Because you say you have this, I don't know what you would call it. It probably isn't an exchange. It probably isn't a dialogue. But it's something where there's a strong, palpable connection.
I'll say 2 things about that. I started therapy during the pandemic. Again, I had started when I was in Los Angeles for the first time some months before my first book came out, and it really changed my life. And then when I moved to New York last summer, I felt that I was doing okay, and then couldn't find a great therapist in New York. Well, I couldn't find a therapist that I felt resonated with me. And then the pandemic hit, and the uprising hit, and life hit in so many ways. And I remember I said, I just need some help. And I had this sense that I needed not just a therapist, and I tend to go to somatic therapists, which, if you read the book, The Body Keeps Score, it's the sense that trauma is sort of embedded in the body and can't just be talked away. But I had this sense that I needed more than a therapist, that I also needed kind of a spiritual teacher of sorts. I was raised, sort of fundamentalist Christian, and thankfully I've been out of that for a very long time, which does not necessarily mean that I've forfeited my spiritual life. So I found this man who was a psychoanalyst, but also was, a gay man married to a neuroscientist who, despite being raised Roman Catholic, was now a mystic Jewish rabbi and had read tarot cards in New Orleans for a decade. So literally a perfect person for me. And in our first session, he said, "Have you ever driven a car?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, at any time when you were driving the car, did you ever become the car?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, that's what I want you to understand about you in relationship to Casey. When you have a car and it goes bad or breaks down, you send it to the junkyard. That doesn't mean you stop driving. Similarly, your soul, your spirit, whatever you want to call it, has come into this vehicle called Casey. And when that vehicle is done, it'll go to the grave. But that does not mean at all that you will stop going on." And so the broader sense as it relates to my grandmother is, and this is why I think the essay, and I'm sure so many writers have this experience where you start something and you think the sentences won't come, but it actually is the wisdom that hadn't come yet. My grandmother, as she was dying, they hadn't been feeding her, and my cousins and I were very angry at our parents because they weren't doing more to keep her alive. And our sign that she wanted to stay alive at that time was she had mumbled. She hadn't talked in 3 or 4 days, and then she said very faintly one night, "God, give me strength." And I remember calling my family. I said, "Y'all, she's fighting to live. Give the woman a chance. You murderers, you bastards. What are you doing?" And then time goes and you get more insight. And I realized that what you actually need strength to do is let this body go. What you actually need strength to do is let this thing that doesn't work anymore go. And it's so fascinating to have had that experience in 2018 and now be living through a year where we in this country, I can't speak for the world because I haven't been out of the country in some time, where we are going through this sort of death. There's no question that we're going through a death, many deaths.
Yeah.
And so I think about what my grandmother said when she says, "God, give me strength to let this thing go." And I feel in her presence when I speak to her, when she visits me in dreams, I feel that it's almost inappropriate to call her Clarice, which was her name in her physical body. It's almost inappropriate to call her my grandmother, right? Because she has gone on, I'm sure, to many more marvelous things. So it's very early in my understanding of it, but it's early in an exciting way that she let this tired vehicle go and she's on to new adventures, and it gives me a lot of comfort in a time like this.
What a beautiful beginning to our conversation, Casey. Really tremendous. There's a Kendrick Lamar lyric that really, I think, matters to you, in which he says, I'm not on the outside looking in, not on the inside looking out. I'm in the dead fucking center looking around. I'd love you to expand on that, and I feel in some very strange way that it works for what we just said in relationship to your grandmother. I'm curious how these lines work for you and what they mean for you and why they matter to you.
Well, they mattered at the time that they came to me, and funny enough, Los Angeles plays such a big role in my life, although I'm not from California, don't live there. I first heard that I was driving in 2018, I moved from Austin, where I had written my book, and I moved out to Los Angeles, and I drove this big, nasty U-Haul truck, and you kind of run out of stuff to listen to on that drive. And so I was going back and listening to Kendrick's old albums, and I came across that line, and it was a great articulation for me because I remember when I started my book, There Will Be No Miracles Here, and I knew that I had kind of, and this is why writers like Clarice Lispector mean so much to me, I knew that I had been strange all my life, and and I was talking to the fantastic writer Kweke Emezi some time ago, and they were saying, when we were on the phone one night, and they said, Casey, at some point you just have to accept that you're an outsider, that you're just fucking strange. Yeah. And it was such a relief because when I started this book, I sent a few chapters to a very, very respected writer friend of mine. And he said, Casey, what the hell is this? You've been hired to write an autobiography. It's a straightforward exercise. It's grounded in the facts of your life. It's got a beginning, middle, and end. And there's a great tradition, by the way, of autobiography in this country that's led by people on the margins of society who write to assert that they exist. Right. You should go and read, Frederick Douglass, read Maya Angelou. I mean, learn from them because this is not it. And it was so important to me to have that intervention and to really be really sad and depressed for a few days, if not a week, because so much of my process, whether it's writing that book or writing my essay, The Black Art of Escape, or working on this film script, is going through that really dark period of trying to figure out what the thing is not. I knew that I had no interest in writing a book to prove that I existed. I knew that. And I hadn't been on the margins of anything, you see. I had been at the very, very epicenter of my experience. And I thought the literature needed to express that so much of this moment is, the danger of it, I worry, is that we say, well, let's get more Black people writing books. And I say, sure. Well, that's great, but I don't want more Black people writing books telling other people what it's like to be Black because they don't fucking know.
Right.
We hardly know what it's like to be us.
Right. And right. This brings me so much to a story you tell so extraordinarily well, where you a moment in your life where you see a video of George W. Bush telling your story, and tell our listeners what it felt like to, so to speak, see yourself.
Well, I met George Bush in 2015. I was in a buffet line in his presidential library and had just finished talking real cash money shit about him because, it was just like I had been hating George Bush since I was 14. And then I'm standing in the buffet line. I feel this hand on my shoulder. I look around, it's President Bush. And I said, well, I was raised, I think pretty well, and so I wasn't going to be rude to him. So we were standing in this line and we said, he said, well, Mr. President, can you tell me about the process for your painting? And so we started talking about his paintings. He says, where'd you go to school? I said, I went to Yale. He said, I went to Yale too. And he said, what'd you do after that? I said, I went to Harvard Business School. He said, I went to Harvard Business School too. And so we talking. So we start talking in the line and we put some food on our plates and then we're done. And he stands up to me. He says, let me ask you a question. Was your dad around? Now, we hadn't talked to my father at all, but, I had been having questions like this, whatever. So I said it. We moved on. We wound up seated together for the rest of the dinner. and wound up talking a lot. And so after he said, listen, when you're back in town, come talk to me. I want to take you to lunch. So we actually wound up spending a decent amount of time together for, two people, for me and the former president. And one of the things that was interesting, and it really, really helped my book, was that I realized that I couldn't, I had to admit that one, even though I hated him in terms of his policies and his politics, I kind of liked him as a person, and I couldn't get to the place of saying he is Satan incarnate. And more importantly, I said, if I give this person who I truly, truly think has caused great destruction in the world this much grace, then how much more grace do I have to give my mother or my father or my lovers or even myself? So that really changed my approach to the book. But then I later found out that there was this video. He was in L.A., a lot of L.A. stories here. And he was telling this story, and he said, let me tell you about this person that I met in the program that I and President Clinton started. We were sitting at dinner, and there's a young African-American kid, and I say, blah, 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 where are you from? Did you go to college? And he starts talking about this guy who tells him that his dad died early. This is the young African-American kid he met at dinner who's supposed to be me. His dad died early, and his mother was in prison, and he was raised by an aunt who taught him how to play football. And I'm sitting there, I'm like, wait a minute, that's me, And that's not my reality at all. My parents are alive. My mother's never been to prison. My aunt never taught me to play football. But I saw in so many ways how we are so deeply desperate in this country for the faintest proof that the stories are real, that the myths are real, that the beliefs are real. And if there's any hope that I have for 2020, I was reading that great Arthur Miller quote the other day that said, an era can be considered over when all of its myths have been exhausted. And I really really hope that we have seen the limits of substituting hopeful stories for justice.
Right.
And we have seen the limits of turning human beings into symbols. And so I think in so many ways that seeing that video, one, it's rare that you come across the material that's that good in my line of work. So I was very thankful for it, honestly. But aside from that, it really, really made me even more committed to what Kendrick is saying. I want to go so deep as I write my books, as I write my essays, as I try to think about what it means to make a film adaptation of my life. Which is not at all about making a biopic, and not at all about myth making. It's not, it's almost like, how do you go against what Lawrence of Arabia did? How do you go against what to be honest, Hillbilly Elegy is about to do? How do you work against the very ingrained sensibilities of American myth making,
right.
And I think it's a very hard job, but it's a lot of fun also.
Right, and working against the grain, and you tell this amazing story in The Black Art of Escape of going to see precisely a movie, Fruitvale Station, and it was just so grueling, Casey, to read that. I mean, I'm not a Black American, but I felt I understood, what it means to have a reaction in the room, in the movie theater, like the one you experienced, where all the white kids are crying and saying, I can't believe this happened in America. And you are saying, just fucking believe it.
That's right. I mean, I think one of the reasons that Black people, and again, this is a flat analysis, but I'm just going to give it because it's true enough that I can feel comfortable with it. One of the reasons that, Black people, and maybe the Irish also, are so funny is because it's so fucking absurd what we
right.
that otherwise you have to ask yourself, how in the hell are the people still alive? And so you have to have an ability to really not expect anything to change, anything to get better. You have to have the ability to do that, and to also accept and not beat yourself over the head trying to convince white people to love you and convince white people to believe the truth about their society. You have to be able to do all of that and still laugh and smile and love your children and raise them and try to love somebody else and, plant your gardens. And it's a very interesting sort of magic trick that we have to pull off to live in this country. But I hope, again, if there is some hope for this year, it is that maybe, we'll see, but maybe white Americans come to believe and understand the truth of their society once, as Arthur Miller says, all the fantasy has been exhausted. And
right.
I hope that has happened this year. Only time will tell.
And Casey, it's been so interesting in these quarantine tapes. One word that has come back again and again and again and again is the word maybe. It's interesting, maybe, and shards of hope. And in an essay precisely from the New York Magazine article I mentioned called The Black Art of Escape, you write about transgenerational trauma. And then you ask yourself this question, which I want you now to answer. Might we access also transgenerational ecstasy?
Oh, certainly.
How?
Certainly, especially in the context of what I've described in terms of my expanded understanding of what it means to be in these physical bodies. A dear friend of mine, Sarah Lewis, who's an art historian at Harvard, was brilliant soul. And she called me a few weeks ago and she said, you have to read the book by Brian Weiss, Many Lives, Many Masters. And it's this fascinating book that I encourage everybody to read, that is this very, very hardcore scientist, psychoanalyst who gets this patient that he can't help until he starts doing these past life regressions with her. And some aspect of her can remember all of these lives that they've had because their lives were, she was in a male form or female form or a non-gendered form or, was a peasant and, so there is no question, and this is the metaphysical side, I'll give the more practical side. There's no question that we have far more resources at our disposal than we are conditioned or trained to believe. My worry is not that we are socially distant, which we are and which we have been even before quarantine. My worry is that we're spiritually distant.
Yes.
And unless we leave this time with a more serious understanding of our spiritual and ancestral, is the only way I can put it, resources, then it's going to be very hard for anybody to believe that we can access transgenerational ecstasy. On a very practical level, and this is why I moved back to Texas in part, I went down to a little tiny town with my partner, where his family is from, and it was so powerful to be there, two young Black queer Americans in a little, I won't call it a shit town. I'm from Dallas, so anything that's not Dallas is a shit town in Texas. But this little tiny town, man. Half of there's a Confederate monument. There's a Confederate monument, at the town square, and, if I can kiss my lover in front of the town square Confederate monument, and in this little tiny town in Texas, in part because we know what our people in this state and both of our families have been in Texas since before the Civil War. My grandmother's grandfather was born enslaved. So there's got to be more to the story. And they were born, they suffered, and they died. They had joy, they had love, they had picnics. That great Lucille Clifton, won't you celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed? Now think about that at the multi-generational level. So yes, I have tremendous hope, in part because I know we all came into these physical bodies for very, very beautiful reasons. And I know that once we're out of these vehicles, we're going to keep on driving in some form, and it's all going to be good.
You know, you quote two writers who matter tremendously to me. One is Flaubert, and the other one is Marguerite Yourcenar. And Marguerite Yourcenar, in her Memoirs of Hadrian, quotes Flaubert, who says, "There was a time when the gods have ceased to be, and the Christ had not yet come, and man stood alone." What does this line mean to you, and how does it speak to you, perhaps even in this current moment, Casey?
Well, that's where we are, to me, without question. You know, it's funny because as I mentioned, I was raised a fundamentalist Christian and believed that Jesus was coming back at midnight, December 31st, 1999, and really did prepare myself for the apocalypse and the end of the world. And it turns out that I did live to see the apocalypse and the end of the world just 20 years later and in a different form. There's no question to me. I think about Jean-Luc Nancy, the French philosopher, right? You know, the sense that it is the end of a world. There's just no question about it. It is the end of a world. And I was talking to a dear friend of mine who can talk about intergenerational ecstasy, a dear friend of mine who can trace his lineage through the Jewish rabbis all the way back for 2,000 years, knows that his lineage goes that deep. And he was so depressed. He called me one day in June or July, and he said, "You know, I just have no hope for the country." And I said, Jeff, somebody who shares your blood was alive in Jerusalem when the temple was destroyed. Okay. And you're here. You can't, I don't see how you could have no hope, because if somebody with your blood survived that, I'm sure you can survive this. Now, that's not to say that was an easy thing for those people,
right,
when that temple was destroyed. But it also, the reality of it is, as he said, it led to one of the biggest transformations in the history of Jewish life. And so I do fundamentally believe that if we can take advantage of world endings, if we can take advantage and really, really sit in the, it's almost like we need to shiva with ourselves for some time and sit and be alone and really close the spiritual distance between us and us, between you and you see. And then come back on the other side of this, hopefully more clear about what this whole exercise is about. And so I think about that Flaubert quote quite a bit. And I also have been feeling that for some time. You know, it's funny. I didn't, when we went into quarantine, nobody was in television studios anymore. And so you say, well, what the hell do I post? What media clips do I post on social media about this time? And everybody's at home. Yeah. But I had done an interview on Morning Joe in 2018. And I said at that time that we're in the early days of a beautiful and dangerous revolution in this country. And that was 2018. Everybody looked at me like I was insane, and maybe I am insane. I don't know. But I got it honest if I am. But this is not something that just popped up in 2020, and it's not something that's going to be over when we get a vaccine and we're done in 2021. I think there are many of us, and maybe this is one reason why you think about the 15,000 people at the Trans March in Brooklyn. Maybe this is why, queer people have throughout history been those who stand between worlds, who are kind of outside, not to be cast aside, but to see through the veil or through different portals or see a different way of being. And so I think there are those of us, there are some of us, I think, who are just constitutionally predisposed to being useful in particular ways at this time. And I hope that we know that our work is important and that we're not alone, either amongst people, our peers or contemporaries, but also in a more intergenerational sense.
Casey, it's been such a pleasure to talk with you. Really, really, really. I've been looking forward to it, and it's happened. Thank you so much for taking this time. Really, stay safe. And I hope someday, somehow, somewhere, we meet in person.
Thank you, Paul. This has been really marvelous, and I know we will.
Take good care of yourself. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.